Haunted Room 1313, The True Horror of Kimpton Hotel Exposed. Audio short horror story. Chapter 1, The Daredevil's Bet. The Kimpton Hotel stood imposingly against the fading light of dusk, its grand facade both majestic and sinister. Established at the turn of the century, it had witnessed decades of splendor and decay, its history soaked into the very bricks that formed its towering walls. Now it was famed not for its luxury or its long-standing service, but for a singular, unsettling reputation: Room 1313. Mike Enlin, a man who had built his career on debunking myths and challenging the unknown, stared up at the hotel from the curb. His eyes, sharp and analytical, scanned the building with a mixture of disdain and curiosity. Mike was known for his scathing critiques of paranormal phenomena, his skepticism as strong as the coffee he drank in endless quantities. For years, he had prided himself on untangling the tangled webs of superstition with reason and evidence. When he had first heard about Room 1313, it had been over a glass of bourbon in a dimly lit bar, where local tales of hauntings had swirled as freely as the smoke from his cigar. The bartender, a weathered man with a voice rough as sandpaper, had spun a yarn about the room's malevolent spirit and the misfortunes of those who dared to sleep there. Mike, ever the skeptic, had scoffed at the story, dismissing it as another overblown piece of folklore. But as the tales of Room 1313 persisted, a challenge had emerged. The room's reputation grew darker, its story more elaborate, and Mike felt an itch that only one thing could scratch: proving the stories false. The hotel had made a convenient backdrop for his next adventure, a chance to expose the truth behind the so-called hauntings. He entered the grand lobby of the Kimpton, where the air was cool and heavy with the scent of old wood and polished marble. The opulence of the space was undeniable, yet there was an undertone of decay that marred its beauty. The walls were adorned with faded portraits of former guests, their eyes seemingly following Mike as he made his way to the reception desk. The receptionist, a young woman with a perfectly groomed appearance, greeted him with a practiced smile. "Welcome to the Kimpton Hotel, Mr. Enlin. How may I assist you today?" "I'm here to check in. Room 1313, Mike replied, his tone steady and confident. The receptionist's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but it quickly returned to its former warmth. "Ah, Room 1313. Right this way, Mr. Enlin. I trust you've been informed of the room's reputation?" Mike's gaze flickered with curiosity. "I'm aware. That's precisely why I'm here." As they walked down the corridor, Mike noticed how the hotel staff seemed almost rehearsed in their indifference, their eyes betraying no hint of concern or curiosity. It was as if the stories had become so routine that they no longer stirred any real emotion. When they reached Room 1313, the receptionist handed him the key with a formality that bordered on the mechanical. "If you need anything, don't hesitate to call," she said, her voice smooth but lacking warmth. Mike took the key and turned to face the door, its dark wood and brass numbers gleaming in the dim light. He inserted the key into the lock and opened the door with a creak that seemed louder than it should have been. The room was exactly as he had expected, a blend of old-world charm and modern amenities, its furnishings elegant but worn. Mike tossed his bag onto the bed and began to unpack, his mind already racing through the possibilities. This was his chance to prove, once and for all, that there was nothing supernatural about Room 1313. But as the evening shadows lengthened and the quiet of the hotel settled around him, Mike felt a creeping sense of unease. He pushed it aside, focusing instead on the task at hand. Tomorrow, he would begin his investigation into the room's dark past. For now, he would sleep in the very heart of the mystery, determined to unravel the truth behind the stories. Little did he know, Room 1313 had its own plans for him, and the line between reality and the supernatural was about to blur in ways he could never have imagined. Chapter 2, Echoes of the Unseen. The clock on the nightstand ticked with relentless precision, each second a reminder of Mike Enlin's challenge. Room 1313 was an exercise in patience and skepticism, a test of his belief that the supernatural was nothing more than a collection of overactive imaginations and poorly told stories. The room, bathed in the dim glow of an antique lamp, seemed to mock him with its mundane silence. Mike had settled in with a casual air, convinced that the night would pass as any other. He reclined in the armchair by the window, his laptop open and casting a cool light across the room. The eerie tales he had heard about room 1313 seemed distant and absurd in the face of the room's calm, ordinary appearance. Outside, the wind howled faintly, a sound that made the window tremble just a bit. Inside, Mike barely registered the creaking of the floorboards or the occasional flicker of the lamp. He attributed these noises to the hotel's age, nothing more than the house settling into its own skin. He was deep into his research when the first real disturbance occurred. The lights above him flickered erratically, casting a jittery dance of shadows across the walls. Mike glanced up, his face a mask of skepticism. "Power issues," he muttered to himself, fingers flying over the keyboard as he continued his search. The laptop screen illuminated his furrowed brow, its backlight reflecting the intensity of his focus. Mike's fingers paused as he scrolled through the scant records he could find about room 1313. The information was as insubstantial as the stories he had dismissed. A series of anecdotes and half-truths, none offering any solid details. He leaned back and sighed, frustration bubbling beneath his calm exterior. His books and articles on the supernatural were filled with evidence of the inexplicable, yet here he was, grappling with the utter lack of credible information. The legends of room 1313 seemed to exist in a nebulous space between fact and fiction, with no tangible anchor in reality. The cold draft that swept across the room was his next distraction. It was a chill that crept through the air, settling into his bones despite the warmth of the room. Mike adjusted the thermostat and wrapped himself tighter in his jacket, dismissing the draft as another quirk of the old building's aging infrastructure. His mind drifted back to his previous works, where he had meticulously debunked supposed hauntings and myths with nothing but cold, hard facts. One book, in particular, had dissected the phenomenon of ghost sightings, offering explanations that ranged from psychological tricks to environmental factors. He had prided himself on the ability to see through the fog of superstition. In a moment of introspection, Mike glanced at the stack of his own publications on the desk. The titles were a testament to his career, a career built on proving that the unseen was merely misunderstood or misrepresented. Yet here he was, in the heart of the very room he had set out to disprove, and the edges of his certainty were beginning to fray. The first night continued with an air of oppressive calm. The flickering lights settled, and the draft subsided, leaving Mike to wrestle with his growing unease. He tried to ignore the subtle creaks and groans of the old building as he lay in bed, his thoughts churning with the questions that he had hoped to answer with a single night of observation. As the hours passed and darkness deepened, Mike's skepticism remained his shield, though it was starting to feel more like a fragile barrier against an encroaching sense of dread. He closed his eyes, attempting to sleep, but his mind was restless, haunted by the knowledge that room 1313 was more than just a room. It was a challenge, and it seemed determined to unravel the very fabric of his beliefs. Little did he know, the night was far from over, and room 1313 had only begun to reveal the complexities of its dark legacy. The boundaries between skepticism and fear would blur, and Mike's understanding of reality would be tested in ways he could never have anticipated. Chapter 3: Unearthing the Dark Past. The morning light filtered weakly through the heavy drapes of room 1313, casting an anemic glow across the room. Mike Enlin awoke with a nagging sense of urgency. The quiet of the previous night had left him restless, and the creeping sense of unease from his first night's stay had only fueled his determination to investigate further. After a quick breakfast in the hotel's grand dining room, Mike made his way to the hotel's archives, a room tucked away in a forgotten corner of the building. The archives were a labyrinth of dust-covered shelves and ancient records, a place where the passage of time seemed to halt. The smell of old paper and leather filled the air, and the silence was punctuated only by the occasional rustle of a page or the creak of the floorboards. Mike met with the hotel's historian, a gray-haired man named Harold, who had the kind of air about him that suggested he was both a keeper of secrets and a reluctant witness to them. Harold's eyes, sharp and weary, met Mike's with a knowing glance. "So you're the skeptic who's taken up residence in room 1313? Harold asked, his voice gravelly. "That's right. I need to know what's really behind the stories," Mike said firmly, placing a small stack of notes on the desk. Harold nodded slowly, a flicker of something, concern perhaps, flashing across his face. "The records are there if you're willing to dig. But be warned, not everything you uncover will make you feel comfortable." Mike took this as a challenge and began sifting through the files and ledgers. As the hours passed, he came across a series of unsettling entries. The records were filled with accounts of guests who had checked into room 1313 and never checked out. Stories of vanished people, sudden illnesses, and inexplicable tragedies began to paint a disturbing picture. Among the most chilling accounts was that of a young couple who had come to the hotel for their honeymoon. They were found dead in their room under mysterious circumstances, their bodies discovered only when the stench of decay became unbearable. There were no signs of forced entry or any clear cause of death. The official records offered no explanations, only empty spaces where answers should have been. Mike's initial skepticism began to waver as the stories piled up. He found himself increasingly absorbed in the hotel's dark history, his mind racing through the details and connections. He was determined to find a rational explanation, but the more he dug, the more his own dread grew. It was as though the room was drawing him into its web, feeding off his curiosity and fear. Desperate for more concrete answers, Mike sought out local historians and former guests who had encountered the room's eerie reputation. He found a small historical society that maintained a trove of local lore and spoke with several elderly individuals who had once stayed at the Kimpton Hotel. One of these was Clara Bellamy, a retired teacher with a sharp memory and a cautious demeanor. Clara had stayed at the hotel decades ago and had witnessed strange occurrences in room 1313. Her account was detailed and vivid, the door slamming shut on its own, a shadowy figure appearing at the edge of her vision, and a pervasive sense of being watched. "I thought it was just my imagination at first," Clara recounted, her voice trembling. "But when I woke up one night and found myself unable to move, I knew something was wrong. I felt a presence, like someone or something was right there with me." Mike listened intently, though he struggled to reconcile her experiences with his own rational explanations. Clara's account, like the others he had heard, added another layer of complexity to the mystery. The rational part of his mind clung desperately to explanations. Faulty wiring, drafts, psychological effects, but the creeping doubt was harder to dismiss. As he continued his research, Mike's obsession grew. The line between his professional detachment and personal unease began to blur. He felt as if he were chasing shadows, with every piece of evidence leading him further into a maze of unanswered questions. His initial resolve to disprove the supernatural was being slowly eroded by the very history he had set out to uncover. The more Mike learned, the more he felt the oppressive weight of room 1313's legacy. It was as though the room itself was whispering to him through the old records and the accounts of those who had come before him. Each revelation seemed to draw him deeper into the room's dark embrace, challenging his skepticism and pushing him to confront the reality of what lay beyond the veil of the known. As Mike returned to room 1313 that evening, he was weighed down by the disturbing facts he had uncovered. The shadows in the room seemed darker, the silence more profound. His quest for truth had taken on a new urgency, and with it, a creeping realization that he might be on the brink of uncovering something far more unsettling than he had ever anticipated. Chapter 4: Shadows in the Night. The chill in room 1313 had taken on a new intensity, seeping into Mike Enlin's bones and gnawing at his resolve. The room, once a mere setting for his investigative challenge, now felt like a living entity, a dark presence that seemed to breathe and pulse with malevolent intent. The first sign of escalation came in the form of disembodied whispers. At first, they were faint, like the echoes of a conversation drifting through the walls. Mike had tried to ignore them, attributing them to the settling of the old building or the wind playing tricks. But the whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they became an incessant murmur that twisted through his thoughts. One evening, as Mike was hunched over his laptop, researching the room's history, a sudden coldness swept over him. The temperature dropped so abruptly that he could see his breath misting in the air. The lamp flickered violently, its light casting erratic shadows that danced across the walls. Mike's heart pounded as he looked around, his skepticism waning. He dismissed the creeping fear as a result of his own exhaustion and stress. "It's just the old wiring," he muttered, though his voice betrayed a tremor he couldn't quite conceal. He wrapped himself in a thick blanket and tried to focus on his work, but the shadows seemed to move with a life of their own. It wasn't long before Mike saw his first apparition. It appeared at the edge of his vision, a fleeting glimpse of a figure shrouded in darkness, standing just beyond the reach of the lamplight. The figure vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving Mike with a pounding heart and a paralyzing sense of dread. He told himself it was a trick of the light, his mind playing games with him under the strain of his investigation. The disturbances continued to escalate. The once muted whispers now grew into a cacophony of voices, each one indistinguishable from the others, but full of anger and despair. Mike would lie awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, as the voices swirled around him, their words a disjointed chorus that seemed to claw at the edges of his sanity. Strange occurrences began to invade his waking hours as well. Objects in the room moved on their own, books falling from shelves, drawers opening and closing with no apparent cause. One morning, Mike found his belongings scattered across the floor, as though an unseen force had wreaked havoc while he slept. His rational mind struggled to hold on, but the growing evidence was impossible to ignore. In his search for answers, Mike found himself drawn into a deeper investigation. He began to connect the dots between the historical accounts and his own experiences. The apparitions and voices seemed to reflect the tragedies and disappearances he had uncovered in the archives. It was as if the room itself was echoing the suffering of those who had come before him, using Mike's presence as a conduit for its anguish. Mike's isolation deepened. He withdrew from the outside world, consumed by his obsession with room 1313. The hotel's once immense grandeur now felt like a prison, each corridor and shadow a reminder of his entrapment. The guests and staff moved around him like ghosts, their faces blending into the background of his growing paranoia. The once familiar setting of the hotel began to distort into something unrecognizable. The rooms seemed to shift in layout, hallways leading to dead ends, and the very architecture of the building appeared to mock his attempts to find escape. Mike's sense of reality wavered as the line between the physical world and the supernatural grew increasingly blurred. His nights were plagued by vivid nightmares, each one more disturbing than the last. He dreamt of being trapped in a dark void, the voices of the damned closing in on him. He would wake with a start, drenched in sweat, the echoes of his dreams lingering in the dim silence of room 1313. Mike's skepticism had been a shield against the unknown, but it was now shattered. The room's malevolent presence had seeped into his psyche, eroding his ability to distinguish between rational thought and fear. He found himself questioning his own sanity, his once clear perspective obscured by the dark forces he could no longer deny. Desperation drove Mike to seek solace in the few remaining pieces of evidence he could gather. He scoured through his notes, trying to piece together a coherent narrative from the chaos. The connections between the past and his current experiences became increasingly apparent, and he realized with growing horror that the room's haunting was not just a series of random events, but a deliberate and orchestrated terror. As the days turned into a nightmarish blur, Mike found himself trapped in a cycle of dread and disbelief. The room had claimed him, its influence stretching beyond the physical boundaries of its walls and ensnaring his very mind. The investigation had transformed from a quest for truth into a harrowing journey through his own fears and the dark heart of room 1313. The darkness was closing in, and Mike knew that he had to confront the source of his terror if he ever hoped to escape the room's relentless grasp. The next steps in his investigation would be crucial, and he could only hope that the truth, however terrifying, would offer a way out of the nightmare he had willingly stepped into. Chapter 5: The Hidden Truth. The shadows seemed to clutch at Mike Enlin as he navigated the labyrinthine hallways of the Kim Hotel, each corner and corridor appearing to shift and elongate in the dim light. His nights had become a restless blur of whispers and cold drafts, and his days were spent in a feverish pursuit of answers. Driven by a sense of impending revelation, Mike's investigation had led him to a new and unsettling discovery: the hotel's hidden rooms and secret passages. It started with a chance encounter. While exploring the bowels of the hotel, Mike noticed a loose panel in one of the abandoned service areas. His curiosity piqued. He pried it open, revealing a narrow, dusty passageway that had been concealed for who knew how long. The passage was suffused with a musty odor, and the air felt charged with a malevolent energy. Mike's heart pounded with a mixture of fear and excitement as he followed the passage, which twisted and turned like a serpent's coil. The path eventually opened into a concealed room, its existence known only to those who had ventured into the hotel's darkest corners. The room was a shrine to the macabre, an unsettling collection of artifacts and documents, arranged with a meticulousness that suggested both reverence and malevolence. On an old wooden desk lay a series of faded journals, their pages yellowed and brittle. Mike's hands trembled as he picked them up, feeling the weight of their history. The journals detailed the hotel's origins and, more chillingly, the events that had led to the creation of Room 13. The documents painted a horrifying picture of the hotel's past. It was revealed that Room 13 had once been a place of unspeakable cruelty. In the late 19th century, a series of gruesome rituals had been conducted by a deranged individual, a man obsessed with harnessing dark forces. The rituals had involved summoning and binding a spirit of vengeance, a malevolent entity with a deep-seated grudge against the living. The spirit, it turned out, was a tragic figure named Lydia Blackwood, a young woman who had been wronged and betrayed by those she trusted. Her death had been a brutal and unjust one, and her restless spirit had been bound to the room as part of the dark rites. Lydia's tale was one of sorrow and rage, a narrative of betrayal that had turned her into a vengeful specter. As Mike read through the journals, he uncovered the details of Lydia's suffering and her subsequent imprisonment within the room. Her spirit, bound by the dark magic, had taken on a life of its own, manifesting through the very room that had been the center of her torment. Anyone who dared to stay in Room 1313 would become a target of her wrath, subjected to the same terror and despair that had marked her own death. The room's artifacts, a collection of occult objects, arcane symbols, and grim relics, seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. Mike's hands shook as he examined the objects, each one a link in the chain of Lydia's torment. It was clear that the spirit's malevolence was not merely a figment of imagination, but a tangible and destructive force. As Mike pieced together the final pieces of the puzzle, a cold realization settled over him. His skepticism had blinded him to the gravity of his situation. The room's sinister history was not just a series of disconnected events, but a continuous and deliberate cycle of vengeance. Lydia's spirit had been waiting for someone like him, someone to challenge the room's reputation and thereby become its next victim. The revelation came with a heavy price. Mike's sense of reality was unraveling as the full weight of his discovery hit him. The room's oppressive presence seemed to close in on him, its walls whispering in an unintelligible language of despair. The air grew colder, and the shadows deepened, as if the room itself was reacting to his newfound knowledge. Mike's fear reached a crescendo when he felt the presence of Lydia's spirit more intensely than ever before. The temperature plummeted, and the whispers grew into a frenzied cacophony. He could almost feel the spirit's icy fingers brushing against his skin, her anguish and rage palpable. The culmination of his investigation came in a confrontation with Lydia's spirit. The room's shadows coalesced into a dark, indistinct form, a spectral figure wreathed in sorrow and rage. The apparition's eyes glowed with a malevolent light, and a cold, oppressive energy emanated from it. Lydia's wail echoed through the room, a sound of unutterable grief and fury. Mike, driven to the edge of his sanity, faced the spirit with a mixture of defiance and desperation. The room's malevolent forces seemed to feed off his fear, growing more intense with every passing moment. The lines between reality and the supernatural blurred as Mike struggled to maintain his grip on his own mind. In a final, desperate attempt to escape the room's clutches, Mike threw the occult artifacts into the center of the room and tried to dismantle the symbols that had bound Lydia's spirit. The confrontation was both physical and psychological, pushing Mike to his breaking point. His mind was assaulted by the echoes of Lydia's suffering and the dark history of the room. The battle reached a climax as Lydia's spirit let out a final, piercing scream, and the oppressive energy in the room reached its peak. Mike, exhausted and near the brink of madness, felt a sudden shift, a release of the dark pressure that had suffocated him. The room's malevolent force seemed to dissipate, leaving him in a stunned silence. The room fell eerily quiet, and the oppressive cold lifted. Mike, shaken and disoriented, knew that the battle was not over, but had reached a critical turning point. The revelations about Lydia's spirit had brought him face to face with the true nature of his tormentor, and the confrontation had forced him to confront the darkest corners of his own fears. As Mike stumbled out of the hidden room and back into the hotel's corridors, he was left with the sobering realization that the room's malevolence was far from vanquished. The confrontation with Lydia's spirit had been a harrowing glimpse into the darkness that still lurked within room 1313. The path to escape was now clearer, but the true cost of his quest for answers had only begun to reveal itself. Chapter 6: The Final Escape. The hours seemed to stretch into an eternity as Mike Enlin paced the dim confines of room 1313, his mind racing through the horrifying revelations he had unearthed. The room had become a battleground, a place where his skepticism had been relentlessly dismantled, leaving him with only the stark reality of Lydia Blackwood's vengeful spirit. Determined to escape the clutches of the malevolent force, Mike had formulated a desperate plan based on the knowledge he had gathered. The first step in his plan involved dismantling the arcane symbols that bound Lydia's spirit to the room. With a shaking hand, he methodically removed the occult artifacts from their places, careful not to touch the symbols directly. Each piece he removed seemed to release a burst of oppressive energy, making the room grow colder and the shadows darker. Mike could feel Lydia's spirit growing more agitated, the whispers escalating into a frenzy of angry voices. Using the information from the hidden journals, Mike had learned that the spirit was vulnerable to certain elements, ancient symbols that could weaken its hold and disrupt its manifestations. With renewed resolve, he arranged the artifacts in a pattern he hoped would sever the binding spells and weaken Lydia's power. The room's oppressive atmosphere grew even more intense, as though the very walls were closing in on him, pressuring him to abandon his plan. As he placed the final artifact in position, the room erupted into chaos. The temperature plummeted, and the walls seemed to pulse with a dark, throbbing energy. Shadows writhed and twisted, taking on grotesque forms that lunged at Mike from every corner. The spirit's presence was overwhelming, a palpable force of rage and sorrow that sought to tear him apart. In the midst of the turmoil, Mike faced the spirit in a final confrontation. Lydia's apparition loomed before him, a wraith-like figure whose eyes burned with a malevolent light. The coldness emanating from her was suffocating, and the cacophony of voices filled Mike's ears with an unbearable roar. He fought to keep his composure, as Lydia's spectral form seemed to engulf him in darkness. The confrontation was both physical and psychological. Lydia's ghostly form lashed out with an intensity that threatened to consume Mike. Every shadow, every whisper seemed to claw at his sanity, dragging him deeper into the abyss of fear. Mike's breath came in ragged gasps as he tried to hold on to the fragments of his plan, focusing on the symbols and the artifacts that were meant to weaken the spirit. Drawing on every ounce of courage, Mike completed the final arrangement of the artifacts, chanting the protective incantations he had deciphered from the journals. The room's chaotic energy reached a fever pitch, the walls trembling as though the very fabric of reality was unraveling. With a final, guttural scream, Lydia's spirit was forced to retreat, her form dissolving into a swirling vortex of shadows and anguish. The oppressive cold lifted abruptly, and the room fell into an eerie silence. Mike, drenched in sweat and trembling from the ordeal, collapsed onto the floor. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions: relief, exhaustion, and the dawning realization of the true nature of the supernatural. The room's malevolent force had been pushed back, but Mike knew that the victory was not without cost. With the last of his strength, Mike staggered to the door and forced it open. The hotel's corridors seemed to stretch out before him, a labyrinth of shadows and echoes. As he made his way toward the exit, every step felt like a triumph over the darkness that had once held him captive. Mike's escape from room 1313 was a bittersweet victory. He had confronted his deepest fears and emerged on the other side, but the experience had irrevocably changed him. The rational skeptic who had first entered the hotel had been replaced by a man who had faced the inexplicable and survived. The encounter with Lydia Blackwood's spirit had shattered his disbelief and left him with a profound respect for the unknown. As Mike finally stepped out of the hotel and into the crisp night air, he felt a fleeting sense of freedom. The oppressive weight of the room's darkness seemed to lift, and the shadows that had clung to him were slowly receding. He took a deep breath, ready to leave the nightmare behind. Just as he was about to leave the hotel's grounds, Mike's phone rang. The unexpected sound jolted him, and he fumbled to answer it. The voice on the other end was calm, almost detached. "Mr. Enlin," the voice said, "I trust you've had an enlightening experience." Mike's heart skipped a beat. The voice was unfamiliar, yet it carried an unsettling tone. "Who is this?" he demanded, his voice strained. The caller continued, "You're not the first to challenge the room's curse, and you won't be the last. The spirit of room 1313 has a way of moving on to new skeptics, and it seems Lydia's influence is far from over." The call ended abruptly, leaving Mike in stunned silence. The revelation that the room's curse might still be active sent a fresh wave of dread through him. His escape had been narrow, and the specter of Lydia Blackwood might continue to torment others who dared to doubt the supernatural. As Mike walked away from the hotel, his thoughts were a tumultuous mix of fear and resignation. The hotel's dark legacy was far from eradicated, and the curse of room 1313 had likely claimed new victims in the wake of his departure. Mike's own ordeal had ended, but the reality of the supernatural was now an undeniable part of his existence. With a heavy heart and a new understanding of the unexplainable, Mike Enlin left the Kimpton Hotel behind. The experience had forever changed him, leaving him to ponder the nature of the supernatural and the haunting truths that lay beyond the veil of reality.